September 16th, 1945. A dusty street in Koga, Japan. The Willys Jeep rolled to a stop as Private First Class Robert Chen reached into his pocket. Around him, rubble stretched in every direction. Fire-scarred buildings, collapsed walls, civilians in tattered clothing moving through ruins like ghosts. 3 months earlier, these streets had hidden soldiers who would have killed him on sight. Now, a cluster of children stood at the edge of the road, motionless, staring. Chen pulled out a Hershey bar. The children didn't move. He'd been warned they might run, that Japanese propaganda had spent years teaching them Americans were demons who would torture and murder civilians. He unwrapped the chocolate slowly, broke off a piece, and extended his hand toward the nearest girl, maybe 7 years old, barefoot, her face hollow with hunger. She hesitated. Her eyes darted to the other children, then back to the brown square in the American soldier's palm. She'd never seen chocolate before. Most Japanese civilians hadn't. Sugar had disappeared from rations years ago. The girl reached forward, her hand trembling, and took the piece. Within seconds, dozens of children surrounded the Jeep, hands outstretched, shouting a word Chen didn't recognize. Amy, aim, candy. He emptied his pockets, Hershey bars, Tootsie Rolls, chewing gum, while his photographer captured the moment. What neither Chen nor the children realized was that this simple gesture of sharing chocolate would become one of the most powerful symbols of reconciliation in modern history. The moment when former enemies discovered that humanity could survive war, and that sometimes the most profound acts of diplomacy happen not in conference rooms, but on dusty streets where soldiers give children their first taste of sweetness. The radio broadcast crackled through speakers in a Tokyo elementary school classroom on the morning of August 15th, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice, a sound most Japanese had never heard, delivered the unthinkable. Japan would accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. The war was over. 7-year-old Michiko Tanaka sat at her wooden desk, not understanding the words but recognizing the teacher's tears. Within hours, her mother was packing their belongings for a desperate journey to relatives in the countryside. The Americans were coming. For 4 years, Michiko and millions of Japanese children had been taught a singular truth through classroom instruction, government newsreels, and illustrated pamphlets distributed in schools. American soldiers were demons in human form. The propaganda depicted them as beasts who would rape women, torture men, and murder children without mercy. Teachers showed fabricated photographs of supposed American atrocities. Students practiced bamboo spear drills to resist the inevitable invasion. The message was absolute. Death was preferable to capture by Americans. Many Japanese families believed it completely. In Okinawa during the battle, 3 months earlier, hundreds of civilians had committed suicide by jumping from cliffs rather than face American troops. Mothers killed their own children, then themselves, convinced they were sparing them from worse fates. That same psychology now gripped mainland Japan as occupation forces prepared to land. Michiko's family reached their village in the mountains north of Tokyo by early September. Other families arrived daily, abandoning bombed-out city neighborhoods for rural hiding places. The government had prepared civilians for the decisive battle for the homeland, a final stand that would cost millions of lives. When surrender came instead, the propaganda apparatus collapsed, but the fear remained. No one knew what Americans would actually do. Meanwhile, in Yokohama Harbor, troop transports of the U.S. 8th Army approached Japanese shores. Private First Class Robert Chen stood on deck watching the coastline materialize through morning haze. Intelligence briefings had warned the troops about Japanese civilians' conditioning. The soldiers knew they were entering a country where their very presence might trigger mass panic or desperate resistance. Chen checked his rifle, then reached into his pack and felt the reassuring shape of chocolate bars wrapped in brown paper, standard issue in his rations. The Americans expected sullen cooperation at best, armed resistance at worst. What they couldn't predict was that the Japanese people's fear had created a vacuum where a single gesture of unexpected kindness could reshape everything. The propaganda had painted Americans as monsters, but propaganda only worked until reality arrived. On September 8, 1945, the first American jeeps rolled through Tokyo's ruined streets. Civilians pressed themselves against damaged buildings, avoiding eye contact. Children hid behind their mothers. No one spoke. No one approached. The occupation had begun in silence, but that silence was saturated with terror that years of conditioning had made visceral and absolute. What happened next would depend entirely on whether American soldiers proved the propaganda right or shattered it completely. The chocolate bars in Chen's pack would matter more than anyone realized. Japanese adults watched from doorways and windows, uncertain whether to intervene. The soldiers weren't harming the children, they were feeding them. Mothers began approaching cautiously, bowing deeply, speaking words the Americans couldn't understand, but whose meaning was clear: gratitude mixed with disbelief. The scene in Koga on September 16, 1945, was documented by U.S. Army Signal Corps photographers as part of routine occupation documentation. Similar moments occurred across Japan that autumn. In Tokyo, Yokohama, and Osaka, American soldiers encountered the same desperate hunger and distributed the same unexpected gifts. The pattern was consistent: initial fear, hesitant acceptance, then an explosion of childhood joy that transcended language and propaganda. For the Japanese children, most had never tasted chocolate. Sugar rationing had begun in 1940 and tightened progressively throughout the war. By 1944, civilian sugar rations had virtually disappeared, redirected entirely to military use. Chocolate was a concept that existed only in pre-war memories of wealthy families or rumors of Western luxury. The Hershey bar that American soldiers casually pulled from their packs represented abundance that Japanese civilians couldn't comprehend. The American troops carried these items not as strategic tools but as standard rations. K rations and C rations included chocolate bars for their caloric density and resistance to spoilage in tropical climates. Tootsie Rolls had been added to rations because they wouldn't melt in heat. Chewing gum served no nutritional purpose but provided psychological comfort. For American soldiers, these were mundane items. For Japanese children, they were miracles. By late September, the spontaneous candy sharing had become routine across occupied zones. Children learned which roads American convoys traveled. They would wait at intersections calling "aim a aim" as jeeps approached. Soldiers began stockpiling extra chocolate specifically to distribute. Letters home mentioned it. American GIs writing to parents and wives about feeding hungry kids in cities they'd bombed months earlier. The gesture wasn't ordered, it wasn't policy, it was individual soldiers responding to suffering with the only immediate resource they had. But the cumulative effect was creating something MacArthur's headquarters hadn't anticipated: a grassroots reconciliation that propaganda couldn't have achieved. The chocolate wasn't ending hunger. Japan's food crisis would last years. But it was ending something more dangerous: the absolute conviction that Americans were inhuman enemies. That psychological barrier had to break before occupation could succeed. And it was breaking, one Hershey bar at a time, in dusty streets where children discovered that the demons they'd been taught to fear were actually soldiers who smiled and shared their candy. The speed graphic camera weighed nearly 5 pounds, but specialist Eddie Yamamoto carried it everywhere he went through occupied Japan in fall 1945. As a photographer with the 40th 26th Signal Photo Battalion, his job was routine documentation: troop movements, supply operations, infrastructure damage assessments. The candy-sharing moments he captured on September 16th in Koga were just another assignment, another roll of film to process and file. Yamamoto didn't realize he was photographing history. Neither did the dozens of other Signal Corps photographers fanning out across Japan that autumn, capturing similar scenes in Tokyo, Yokohama, and Osaka. American soldiers handing chocolate to Japanese children, small hands reaching up toward olive drab uniforms, children's faces transforming from fear to wonder as they tasted sugar for the first time in years. The photographs arrived at General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo as part of standard weekly documentation packages. Someone in the Public Information Office recognized what they had. These images told a story that official press releases couldn't convey: American forces as liberators and rebuilders, not conquerors. In the emerging Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union, such imagery carried strategic value. Moscow was already broadcasting propaganda depicting American occupation as brutal imperialism. The candy photographs offered immediate, visceral counter-narrative. By October, selected images appeared in Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper distributed across the Pacific. Then came releases to American media. Life magazine published a full spread in November 1945, showing American soldiers distributing candy and rations to Japanese children. The caption described occupation forces bringing relief and friendship to a devastated nation. Time magazine ran similar photographs with headlines about American generosity and victory. The images also reached Japanese audiences. The occupation authorities controlled Japanese media through Civil Information and Education section, which approved all newspaper content. Photographs of American soldiers sharing candy appeared in Tokyo's major dailies, Asahi Shimbun, Mainichi Shimbun, with captions carefully written to contrast American kindness with the suffering caused by Japan's militarist government. The message was clear. Cooperation with occupation would bring benefit, not destruction. The effect proved remarkable. Japanese civilians who had hidden from American troops in September were approaching them by October. Children no longer fled when jeeps appeared. They ran toward them. The photographs in newspapers gave families permission to trust what their own eyes were seeing. If the newspapers showed Americans feeding children, perhaps the propaganda about demons had been lies. Perhaps survival lay in accommodation rather than resistance. MacArthur's headquarters recognized the candy distribution's public relations value and began encouraging it. Quartermasters increased candy shipments to occupation zones. Units received guidance to interact positively with Japanese civilians, especially children. What had begun as spontaneous compassion became calculated policy. The line between genuine human kindness and strategic propaganda blurred completely. But the soldiers handing out chocolate didn't think about propaganda. Corporal James Martinez from the 11th Airborne Division wrote home to El Paso in October 1945. "We give the kids candy because they're starving, and they're just kids. Nobody told us to do it. We just do." That authenticity resonated in the photographs. Viewers could see that the smiles on American faces were real, that the gesture came from individual decency rather than command directive. Japanese mothers began bringing children to areas where American troops worked. Some offered small gifts in return, handmade crafts, origami, drawings. American soldiers started learning basic Japanese phrases. Konnichiwa, hello. Arigato, thank you. Friendships formed across language barriers, built on the foundation of shared humanity that chocolate had revealed. The photographs captured something intangible but essential, the moment when enemies stopped being abstractions and became people. For American soldiers, Japanese children were no longer faceless members of a hostile race, but hungry kids who deserved kindness. For Japanese families, Americans were no longer demons, but soldiers who acted with compassion. By year's end, the candy-sharing photographs had become iconic symbols of post-war reconciliation. They appeared in textbooks, documentary films, and museum exhibitions. They told a story both simple and profound, that even after total war, humanity could reassert itself through small acts of decency. But photographs couldn't feed a nation on the edge of famine. As 1945 ended, Japan faced its harshest winter in decades, with food supplies critically low. The candy had opened doors, but sustaining cooperation would require addressing desperate material needs. MacArthur's headquarters prepared massive food aid programs, knowing that goodwill alone couldn't prevent social collapse. The chocolate had bought trust. Now occupation authorities had to deliver on implied promises of reconstruction and survival. The 1945 rice harvest failed catastrophically. Across Japan's home islands, farmers watched helplessly as poor weather and lack of fertilizer destroyed crops. By autumn, yields had dropped 40% below normal levels, the worst harvest since 1910. For a nation already on the edge of starvation, it was a death sentence. The hunger that Private Chen witnessed in Koga wasn't recent. It had been building for years. Japanese food production had declined 26% during the final 2 years of the Pacific War as the government diverted resources to military production. Fertilizer went to making explosives. Farm equipment wasn't replaced. Men who worked the fields were conscripted into service. Women and students tried to fill the labor shortage but couldn't maintain pre-war production levels. The numbers told a grim story. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, the average Japanese civilian consumed approximately 2,000 calories daily, barely adequate for sustaining health. By 1944, that figure had dropped to 1,600 calories. By summer 1945, it had fallen to 1,680 calories per day, and after surrender, it plummeted to 1,500 calories, below the threshold for avoiding slow starvation. In cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama, which depended entirely on government rationing systems, the situation was worse. Urban residents consumed even fewer calories as distribution networks collapsed. Japan's food crisis wasn't simply agricultural. The nation had become dependent on imports from its colonial territories. Before the war, Korea, Taiwan, and Manchuria supplied 31% of Japan's rice consumption, 92% of its sugar, 58% of its soybeans, and 45% of its salt. The American submarine campaign systematically destroyed this lifeline. By 1945, U.S. submarines had sunk two-thirds of Japanese shipping. Operation Starvation, the aerial mining of Japanese harbors, paralyzed what remained of coastal transport. Shipping through Kobe declined 85% between March and July 1945, from 320,000 tons to 44,000 tons. The fishing industry collapsed. Japan's diet had historically depended heavily on seafood for protein, but fishing boats required fuel oil, which the military controlled completely. Fishermen were conscripted. The fishing catch dropped more than 50% from pre-war levels. Urban Japanese who had relied on fish as primary protein source now had almost nothing. Internal distribution networks disintegrated. American bombing destroyed railroads, warehouses, and transportation infrastructure. Even when food existed in rural areas, no system remained to move it to cities. The government rationing system, which had maintained some equity in distribution earlier in the war, broke down completely. Black markets emerged where farmers demanded exorbitant prices, family heirlooms, kimonos, jewelry, for bags of rice. City dwellers who had once looked down on rural farmers now begged them for food. The Japanese government tried desperate measures. Schools converted athletic fields into sweet potato gardens. Civilians ate every part of the sweet potato plant: leaves, stems, roots. For protein, they caught and ate beetles and beetle larvae found in the soil. Okamura Ayao, a Japanese food expert, later recalled, "Even in the countryside, food was scarce. We ate insects that we found at the roots of plants we picked, which we roasted or mashed." When Japan surrendered in August 1945, approximately 8 million Japanese expatriates returned from Korea, Manchuria, and Taiwan, territories Japan had occupied and now lost. These repatriates added massive demand to an already catastrophic food shortage. The newly liberated Korea and Taiwan, which had supplied much of Japan's rice, were no longer available as sources. The Potsdam Declaration, which outlined surrender terms, promised that Japan would not be enslaved or destroyed as a nation. But promises couldn't prevent mass starvation. American occupation authorities arriving in September 1945 found a population far more desperate than intelligence estimates had predicted. General MacArthur's headquarters immediately requested emergency food shipments from the United States. The contrast between American and Japanese material conditions was stark and visible. American soldiers carried chocolate bars in their rations as routine calories, excess they could afford to give away. Japan couldn't feed its own people basic staples. The gesture of sharing candy represented not just kindness, but the vast gulf between victor and vanquished. The United States possessed such abundance that individual soldiers could distribute sugar casually, while Japanese children had forgotten what sweetness tasted like. American food aid began arriving in fall 1945. Historians estimate these shipments saved approximately 10 million Japanese from starvation through the winter of 1945 to 46. But food alone wouldn't solve Japan's crisis. The entire agricultural system needed rebuilding. Distribution networks required reconstruction. The economy, structured around military production, had to transform. And beyond material needs, Japan's political system, educational institutions, and social structures would require fundamental reform. The chocolate that opened doors between American soldiers and Japanese children had created psychological space for cooperation. But sustaining that cooperation through Japan's harshest winter in decades, through continued hunger and privation, would test whether goodwill could survive when promises of reconstruction met the reality of limited resources and competing priorities. The occupation's success depended not on candy, but on whether MacArthur's administration could deliver genuine material improvement to a desperate population that had every reason to doubt American intentions. Kuniko Cat stood in a Scarsdale supermarket in January 2001, watching a Japanese child complain about wanting candy. The girl was maybe 3 years old, whining in Japanese that she was starving. Her mother finally relented and let her choose a chocolate bar. The girl beamed with triumph. Kat smiled, but the scene triggered a memory 55 years old. She had been that age when she first tasted chocolate in occupied Japan. The circumstances had been dramatically different. She later wrote about that moment in an essay for the Scarsdale Inquirer. It was when the war between the United States and Japan had just ended. An American soldier had given her chocolate, her first taste of sweetness in years. The memory remained vivid decades later, preserved with the clarity that only transformative childhood experiences retain. Kat's wasn't unique. Across Japan, an entire generation carried similar memories. Children born between 1938 and 1945 grew up during occupation, experienced the candy moments, and carried those experiences throughout their lives. They became adults during Japan's extraordinary economic recovery, witnessed transformation from devastation to prosperity, and many credited their openness to American partnership to that initial moment when chocolate contradicted propaganda. The phrase, "give me chocolate," became embedded in Japanese cultural memory. Children in 1945 and 1946 learned it spontaneously, approaching American soldiers and calling out, "Chocorito kudasai," or simply, "give me chocolate," in broken English. The phrase symbolized both humiliation, Japanese children reduced to begging from occupiers, and the beginning of reconciliation. Photographer Shomei Tamatsu later titled his documentary series about American occupation "Chewing Gum and Chocolate," acknowledging how those handouts became defining symbols of the era. Memoirs and oral histories collected through the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s revealed consistent patterns. Adults describing how a Hershey bar contradicted everything they had been taught, how the gesture forced them to question other lies their government had told. One survivor recalled his mother planning family suicide when surrender came, convinced Americans would rape and murder civilians. He had refused, arguing they should wait to learn reality rather than die for rumors. When Americans arrived with food instead of violence, the cognitive dissonance shattered years of propaganda instantly. The chocolate generation shaped modern Japan. They entered universities in the 1950s and 1960s, studying English and American culture with enthusiasm unthinkable before 1945. They built businesses that partnered with American corporations. They became politicians who maintained the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty despite significant domestic opposition. They raised children who grew up viewing America as ally rather than conqueror. Japan's economic miracle between 1955 and 1973, growth averaging 10% annually, transformation from ruins to world's second-largest economy, occurred partly because this generation chose cooperation over resistance. They believed American promises of partnership because those promises began with soldiers sharing candy when they could have demanded submission. But the memory carried complexity. Japanese intellectuals in the 1970s and 1980s critiqued what they called chocolate box memory, romantic nostalgia that erased uncomfortable truths. The same soldiers who handed out candy served in occupation forces that maintained military bases without true Japanese consent, influenced domestic politics, and represented American hegemony in Asia. The atomic bombings haunted the narrative. How could survivors reconcile individual Americans' kindness with incineration of 200,000 civilians weeks earlier? Some rejected the chocolate symbolism entirely, viewing it as manipulation designed to make Japanese forget American war crimes. The gesture was genuine but occurred within framework of military occupation, where American preferences became Japanese policy regardless of popular will. The memories also depended on occupation success. If MacArthur's reforms had failed, if Japan had remained impoverished, the chocolate would be remembered as hollow gesture. But because occupation delivered genuine economic recovery, land reform, educational opportunities, and eventual sovereignty, the chocolate became symbol of beneficial transformation rather than exploitation. By the 1990s, as Cold War ended and Japan's economic power seemed permanent, the chocolate story appeared in museums and textbooks as foundation myth of US-Japan friendship. It served diplomatic purposes, reminding both nations that former enemies could become allies, that reconciliation was possible after total war. But the story's power contained warning. The chocolate worked because it preceded genuine reconstruction. American food aid, economic assistance, and democratic reforms sustained cooperation. Small acts of kindness changed perceptions, but only when followed by actions validating the implied promises. The children who tasted chocolate in 1945 became adults who judged whether America delivered on what that sweetness represented. Hope for better future, partnership instead of domination, shared prosperity rather than exploitation. And largely, America had delivered. The US-Japan alliance became one of history's most successful transformations from enemies to allies. But it succeeded not because of chocolate alone, but because the chocolate opened doors that American policy then walked through with genuine commitment to rebuilding, rather than punishing the defeated nation. The candy was symbol, not substance, but symbols matter when they're backed by substance that validates them. Lieutenant Gail Halverson stood at the barbed wire fence at Tempelhof Airport in Berlin on July 17, 1948. He watched a group of German children pressed against the barrier, watching American C-54 Skymaster cargo planes land every few minutes. The Soviet Union had blockaded all ground access to West Berlin. 2 million civilians trapped in the western sectors depended entirely on the airlift for survival. Coal, food, medicine, everything flown in by American and British aircraft. Halverson approached the children. Through the fence, he asked them about their lives in blockaded Berlin. They spoke of hunger, of rationing, of uncertainty about whether the airlift could sustain the city through winter. What struck Halverson was what they didn't do. They didn't beg. Unlike children he'd seen in other parts of war-torn Europe, these German kids didn't ask for anything. They simply watched the planes with gratitude that Americans were keeping their city alive. Halverson reached into his pocket and found 2 sticks of Wrigley's Double Mint gum. He handed them through the fence to the children. They tore the sticks into pieces, sharing the gum among 30 kids. Those without pieces passed around the wrapper to smell. The gesture reminded Halverson that 3 years earlier, American soldiers in Japan had done something similar. He made a spontaneous promise. Tomorrow, when he flew into Berlin, he would drop candy attached to parachutes for these children. The next day, Halverson and his crew pooled their candy rations. Chocolate bars, gum, anything sweet. They tied handkerchiefs to the candy as makeshift parachutes. On approach to Tempelhof, Halverson's C-54 dropped the candy bundles. German children scrambled to collect them. Letters arrived at the airport addressed to the Chocolate Flyer and Uncle Wiggly Wings. Children had identified Halverson's plane by the distinctive wing wiggle he performed before each candy drop. Word spread. Other pilots joined the effort. American candy manufacturers began donating supplies. Children in the United States launched fundraising drives, sending candy and handkerchiefs to support what became officially designated Operation Little Vittles. Pilots engineered increasingly elaborate parachutes. Some drops included tiny parachutes painted with American flags or messages in German. The Berlin candy drops created parallel symbolism to Japan's chocolate moments 3 years earlier. 2 former enemy populations, both defeated and occupied, both experiencing American generosity through sweetness. German children who had been taught Americans were enemies discovered soldiers dropping candy from planes that could have dropped bombs. The cognitive dissonance shattered propaganda just as effectively as it had in Japan. The pattern revealed emerging American Cold War strategy. In occupied Japan and blockaded Berlin, American abundance contrasted sharply with conditions under Soviet influence. East Berlin, controlled by the Soviet Union, received no candy drops. Soviet-occupied areas offered no Hershey bars. The contrast between American generosity and Soviet repression became visceral and immediate for children who experienced it. But the candy diplomacy succeeded because it was backed by substance. The Berlin airlift delivered 2.3 million tons of supplies over 15 months, sustaining West Berlin through Soviet blockade. The Marshall Plan poured billions into European reconstruction. In Japan, American food aid prevented mass starvation. The candy symbolized American commitment, but massive economic assistance validated the symbolism. The pattern also revealed the limits of gestures without follow-through. In countries where America promised support but delivered minimal aid, the memory of candy would have bred cynicism. But in Germany and Japan, where reconstruction programs were genuine and sustained, the candy became foundation myth of successful transformation from enemies to allies. Gail Halvorson became known as the Candy Bomber, celebrated in both Germany and America. His improvised gesture had become part of Cold War mythology, proof that American values included compassion even for former enemies, that abundance could be shared rather than hoarded, and that small acts of kindness could build bridges between nations. But Halvorson understood what made his gesture meaningful. In a 1998 interview marking the airlift's 50th anniversary, he reflected, "The candy was important because it represented something bigger. We weren't just dropping chocolate. We were dropping proof that freedom meant generosity, that democracy meant sharing, and that Americans cared about people beyond our borders." The candy only worked because the Berlin airlift succeeded. If the blockade had forced West Berlin's surrender, the candy drops would be remembered as futile gesture rather than symbol of American resolve. By the 1950s, the parallel between Japanese and German candy moments became deliberate American policy. Soft power through generosity, reconstruction aid backed by visible symbols of abundance, and cultivation of goodwill in occupied territories. The strategy worked in both countries, helping transform enemies into two of America's strongest allies. But the success depended on specific conditions that couldn't be replicated everywhere. Both Germany and Japan were industrialized nations with educated populations and strong institutional foundations. Both received massive reconstruction aid. Both faced Soviet-aligned alternatives that provided stark contrast. The candy symbolism worked because everything else worked: economic recovery, democratic reform, and genuine sovereignty restoration. The lessons were clear. Small acts of humanity could change perceptions and create psychological space for reconciliation. But gestures without substance bred cynicism. The chocolate and candy that American soldiers shared in 1945 Japan and 1948 Berlin mattered because they preceded years of genuine commitment to rebuilding defeated enemies into prosperous democratic allies. The sweetness opened doors. American policy had to walk through those doors with sustained effort to validate what the candy symbolized. The National W4A Museum in New Orleans opened a new exhibit in 2019 featuring a photograph taken in Koga, Japan, September 1945. American soldiers surrounded by Japanese children, hands outstretched, receiving chocolate. The image had been stored in national archives for decades. Now it hung on museum walls, preserved as artifact of reconciliation. Similar photographs appeared in museums across Japan and America. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum displayed images of occupation-era candy distribution alongside exhibits about atomic bombing, a jarring juxtaposition that captured the complexity of remembering total war and its aftermath. American soldiers who had participated in the most destructive conflict in human history became agents of reconstruction through gestures as simple as sharing chocolate. Veterans who had given away candy as young soldiers in 1945 returned to Japan in the 1990s and 2000s. Some reunited with the children they'd fed, now elderly themselves. These encounters, documented in newspapers and Veteran Association newsletters, revealed how memory had mythologized ordinary moments. The soldiers remembered feeling compassion for starving kids. The Japanese adults remembered those moments as life-changing revelations. Both memories were true, but the gap between individual gesture and historical significance illustrated how small acts acquire meaning through subsequent events. Robert Chen, who had distributed chocolate in Koga in September 1945, returned to Japan in 2002 at age 78. He walked the same streets, now rebuilt and prosperous. A local historical society organized a reunion with people who remembered receiving candy from American soldiers. Chen met a businessman named Takeshi Yamamoto, who claimed to remember Chen specifically, the tall Chinese-American soldier who had smiled and handed him a Hershey bar. Whether the memory was accurate or reconstructed didn't matter. The emotional truth remained: that chocolate had meant something profound. Historians analyzing occupation's success consistently identified the candy moments as psychologically crucial. The gestures created opening that allowed democratic reforms, war crimes trials, and American military bases to coexist with Japanese cooperation rather than guerrilla resistance. John Dower, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning study Embracing Defeat, noted that occupation succeeded partly because individual American soldiers behaved with surprising decency toward civilians, contradicting Japanese expectations of brutality. The U.S.-Japan alliance became one of history's most successful transformations from enemies to allies. The security treaty signed in 1951 anchored American strategy in Asia for decades. Trade between the nations grew to trillions of dollars. Japanese corporations and American companies became deeply intertwined. Cultural exchange flourished. All of this rested partly on foundation of chocolate bars, shared in ruins 75 years earlier. But the story carried cautionary lessons. The candy worked because occupation honored promises of rebuilding and democratization. MacArthur's administration delivered genuine land reform that benefited farmers, educational reforms that democratized schools, and economic policies that enabled recovery. Empty gestures without substance breed cynicism, not alliance. The chocolate symbolized American intentions. Subsequent actions validated or betrayed what that symbolism represented. Other nations received American candy but not sustained Reconstruction aid. In those places, the chocolate was remembered bitterly, a hollow gesture that preceded abandonment. The difference between Japan and less successful American occupations wasn't initial goodwill but sustained commitment to transformation. Small acts of humanity could change perceptions, but only if followed by years of genuine effort to honor the implicit promises those acts made. The legacy also revealed something about reconciliation itself. Even after total war, after atomic weapons and firebombing campaigns that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, enemies could become allies. But reconciliation required both sides choosing it. Japanese civilians who accepted chocolate chose to see Americans as potential partners rather than eternal enemies. American soldiers who shared candy chose to see Japanese children as human beings, deserving compassion rather than perpetual threats. Both choices were necessary. Neither was inevitable. By 2020, few survivors remained who personally remembered September 1945. The generation that experienced chocolate from American soldiers had aged into their 80s and 90s. Their children and grandchildren knew the story only through photographs and secondhand accounts. But the memory persisted in cultural consciousness of both nations, evidence that reconciliation was possible, that humanity could survive war, and that small acts of decency mattered. The photographs in museums told a story both simple and profound. Soldiers giving candy to children, children smiling despite hunger and fear, former enemies discovering shared humanity through sweetness. The images reminded viewers that peace isn't built solely through treaties and diplomacy. Sometimes it begins with simpler gestures, with soldiers who see hungry children and decide to share what they have. But the images also told a more complex truth. The chocolate opened doors. American policy walked through those doors with Marshall Plan aid, food shipments, economic reconstruction, and genuine commitment to democratic transformation. The candy symbolized intentions. Decades of sustained effort validated those intentions. The U.S.-Japan alliance succeeded not because of chocolate alone, but because the chocolate preceded genuine partnership. The lesson endured. In the aftermath of conflict, small acts of humanity create psychological space for reconciliation. But that space must be filled with substance, with kept promises, material support, and long-term commitment to mutual prosperity. Gestures without follow-through breed cynicism. Gestures backed by genuine partnership transform enemies into allies. 75 years after surrender, the story of American soldiers sharing chocolate with Japanese children remained relevant precisely because it captured both the power and limits of human decency. The power, individuals choosing compassion, can change history. The limits, compassion alone isn't enough. The chocolate mattered. But what came after the chocolate mattered more. The photographs in museums would outlive everyone who appeared in them. Future generations would see American hands passing chocolate to Japanese children and wonder about the moment captured. They would learn that sometimes the greatest diplomatic achievements begin not with treaties signed in conference rooms, but with soldiers who see hungry children and decide to share what they have. And they would learn that those gestures only transform history when they're followed by years of work to build the peace that initial moment of kindness made possible. The legacy was clear: reconciliation is possible. Humanity survives war, but peace must be built deliberately, sustained through decades of commitment, and validated through actions that honor what simple gestures symbolize. The chocolate was beginning, not end, and that made all the difference.